In 1615, the Jewish community in Poland was confronted with a disturbing accusation of murder against one of its members. At the time, contemporary rabbis engaged in a dialogue on the most suitable course of action, debating whether the accused should face capital punishment. This analysis remains relevant today, as it prompts us to evaluate whether any of those principles and teachings have the potential to inform contemporary debates on the death penalty. Today we're going to focus on a tshuva from Maharam Lublin. Maharam Lublin is known as the mayor of Lublin. Lublin's a city in Poland. And we all encountered him for the first time when we were learning Gemara. In the back of the Gemara there's a Pirush of the Maharsha, and under the Pirush of the Maharsha is a Pirush of the Maharam. This is the Maharam that we're talking about. His name was Reb Meir. His dates are 1558 to 1616. Now, in addition to this Sefer, the commentary on the Gemara, which he published, by the way, that Sefer has a name. It's called Meir Einei Chachamim. But, as many Sfarim, we just refer to it as the Maharam. In addition to this commentary on the Gemara, he also wrote Tshuvas, and his son published a relative of his published a Tshuvas that he sent during his lifetime as a Rav in different cities in Poland, and they were published soon after his passing. And we're going to look at one of the Tshuvas. What's interesting about this Tshuva, Simin Kuf Lamed Ches, is this Simin Kuf Lamed Ches. When the Sefer was printed in Russia for the first time, it was printed in Russia in 1834. Then later it was printed in Russia again in 1881 in different cities in Russia. This tshuva was taken out, was not present there. In earlier prints, when it was printed in Italy and in other countries, it was there, Siman Kuf Lamed Ches. In the Russian prints, it was taken out. So it goes Kuf Lamed Zayin, Kuf Lamed Tes. They didn't change the numbers like this. Anyone with a half of an eye open would be able to realize that there was a tshuva missing here. But tshuva was taken out. Why? So as we move through the content of the tshuva, it will be clear why this was censored, dafke in the Russian editions of the Sefer. The tshuva that we have, this tshuva does not have a date on it. Most of the tshuvas do not have a date. However, what's interesting is someone found in the Bodleian Library in Oxford a ksav of this tshuva. And it has the ha'aris on the side that are written by a man named Shmuel. As we're going to see, this tshuva was written to a man named Shmuel. So the going hypothesis is that the recipient of the tshuva, the same Reb Shmuel who received the tshuva, wrote the ha'aris on the side. So the theory is that this ksav is the actual piece that went from the Maharam to this Reb Shmuel. When a Rav would write a tshuva, there would be two copies. One that he would keep in his archive, which is how the Sefer was published. The Sefer Tshuvas from a Rav is published from his own personal archive that he kept. And the theory is that this ksav in the Bodleian Library in Oxford was what the recipient Reb Shmuel received. And on that version there's a date. What is the date? The date is 1615. Leil Dalet Parshas Tetzaveh, Shin Ayin Hey, which is the year 1615, which is interesting because it's 1 year before Maharam Lublin passed away. So let's move into this tshuva. It's addressed to Ha'aluf Ha'mufla, Moreinu Arav Reb Shmuel, and we know about the Reb Shmuel that lived at this time. He was the Av Beis Din of the Polish city of Przemysl, and this is he's mentioned in other times and other places, this Reb Shmuel, and so it seems that it was written to him. What's the case? Higia liyadi hapsak din asher charatzta. I received your psak din. Al dvar hamaiser hamechur v'hazar, about the bizarre and terrible, disgusting incident. What was the incident? Avoin horetzicha, the sin of murder. She'asa echad mipritei b'nei amenu, that one of our fellow Jews was involved in. So a Jew was involved in a murder. Kiniskar be'edius asher shalach mailas kvoy tarasel liyadi, and as is mentioned in the testimony, in the affidavits that you sent to me. V'haposheya haroitzeach hu b'maiser uv'mishter biyad hapokid. The suspected murderer, the person accused of murder, he is right now in jail. He's incarcerated. By who? The pakid. Who's the pakid? The Polish nobleman. He's holding on to him. It has not been specified yet what is going to happen to him. What are we going to do with this Yiddish murderer? Ubikesh malas kvoi toirasa mimeni. So you, Reb Shmuel, you're asking me, lechaves daiti, you're asking me, Maharam Milublin, to express my opinion. Lahalacha lemaisa bisman hazeh. Tell me the halacha today in the year 1615. What are we supposed to do? What's the shaila? What are we supposed to do? So in this time, what's very important to know here is when the Jews were living in Poland in the 1500s and 1600s, even into the 1700s, there was a significant degree of autonomy that the Jewish community had. And every time and place is different in this area. When the non-Jewish hosts would give the Jews a contract that allowed them to live in a certain place, there was always different conditions. And sometimes it was more autonomy, sometimes less. The Jews in Poland had a lot of autonomy. And one of the things as part of this autonomy was that they were able to police themselves, including taking care of their own murderers. And so therefore it was a real shaila to the Rav, Reb Shmuel, what should I do with this person? In other words, if we want, we can put him to death. We can execute him, us on our own. And the question is, should we do it? Halacha l'maisa bisman hazeh. So you ask, V'im yafe danta, did you write a good opinion? V'im yafe zichisa malakoisa nafesh. And did you do a good job when you acquitted him? In other words, Reb Shmuel sent the affidavits, all the testimony to Maharam Lublin. And he also wrote a tshuva. And he wrote a tshuva of his opinion, his judicial opinion. And what does it say in the tshuva? We should not kill him. We have the ability to kill him. We should not kill this Reitzayach. And now he's asking Maharam Lublin, who was older than him and was a greater sage, whether he agrees with him or not. So Maharam Lublin says as follows, V'ine hagam sha'ani ka'eis bilti miyushav. Right now I'm unsettled. Ve'en kli tashmishi biyadi, and I don't have my svarim, my tools, I don't have them with me. They're still in Lublin. Maharam Lublin lived in Lublin. That's why he has that name. But Kenida from this tshuva, he moved away from Lublin. But he didn't yet bring his svarim in this year in 1615. And so therefore, it's going to be hard for me to write a tshuva without having my svarim. But Asher B'Ksara, I'm going to write a short tshuva, and this is what he's going to write. Now, before we go into the tshuva, we need to pause here, and we need to say, hold on a second. What's going on over here? Yes, I know that there's a concept of a mishpat mavis in Torah, but there's severe limitations on that mishpat mavis. Why is there even a shaila over here? Why is there even a shaila? So yes, this week's parsha, look at number 2, says, Make ishva ameis mois yumas. When a person kills another person, there is a death penalty. We recognize that. However, together with knowing that, we also know about the limitations. What are the limitations? So let's look actually in the Rambam of Perek Echad cycle. It's Haitek Rambam. What does he say? V'chol beis din shehargu nefesh b'shava shanim. If a beis din killed once in 7 years, harei elu chavlanin. So they are a murderous beis din. They're a bloody beis din. What does this mean? Why, if a beis din killed once in 7 years, is it a murderous beis din? Because when we look at all of the rules and regulations about when and how a court can execute someone, you realize that it could happen, as we say in Yiddish, once in a yovel. Why? So let's see. Let's look at number 4, what the Rambam says about the standard of evidence that's necessary. Zok the Rambam, Ein based in oinshin ba'oimed adas. A beis din is not allowed to punish based on estimations. El al pi edim beraya bru. It has to be witnesses with clear proof. And then the Rambam goes on to say the famous example. Even if witnesses saw someone pursuing another person, a pursuer chasing a victim, and then they lose sight for a minute, and then they come into the house and they see a person holding a knife, it's dripping blood, and there's a guy dead lying right over there. So like, okay, we saw everything, we just didn't see the act of murder. Afal pikein, this is not considered a murder that we can execute the Reitzeach in this type of case. Ein beis din hargin be'eduzeh. It doesn't work. So why? Because you need to have the highest standard of evidence, no circumstantial evidence. Even if it's like really, really close to like certain, and mamish certain, but if you didn't see it, it doesn't work. This is in addition to the fact that the person needs to have hasra, and the person needs to say, by the way, you're doing this is the punishment, and the person has to hear and say, I accept it, and respond back right. Well, how often is that going to happen? Now, the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos addresses the question, the obvious question. That is, why does Torah have such a high standard? Why is it that Torah has such a high standard? So let's look at what the Rambam says in Sefer HaMitzvos. Very interesting. Ve'ilu hirshus haTorah lekayim oinshim be'efshar hakarev ma'od. If Torah allowed us to punish in cases that had a very, very strong circumstantial case of evidence, az hayu mekayimim es ha'oinshim b'mashu yoser rachik mizeh. What would happen is we would also start punishing if it was a little weaker type of evidence. And then, and then eventually we would be executing when where the evidence is even more flimsy, right? What's the issue here? The issue Rambam's contending with is, how do you draw the line? How do you say this is yes and this is no? So in those societies and where we say it needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That's the society we live in. It needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Who decides? The jury decides it beyond a reasonable doubt. You can have cases in where it is like, wow, it's like very, very strong circumstantial case, and the person is held guilty beyond, because the jury found that it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And you can have cases where you look at the case, and you look at the evidence, you're like, I don't know, right? It gets a little more flimsy. Why? It's very hard to draw the line. How do you define what does it mean beyond a reasonable doubt? So the Rambam is basically saying there is no real place to draw a line to make it, yeah, this is where we're comfortable, and this is where we're not comfortable. There isn't really a real place where to draw the line. Where can you draw a line? You could draw a line and say, if two witnesses come and testify that they saw, that's clear, that's a line. So therefore the Torah says, he's saying that the Torah had to make this stark line, and basically everything else is unacceptable. The concern is that once you open the door to circumstantial evidence, so then you're going to end up Yamisu bnei Adam be'umdan kal lefi dimyoin hashofet. It's going to end up being with, even if it's a schwache evidence, weaker evidence. But the judge says, you know something, it makes sense to me, as I lakes up by me, and we're going to end up killing the person. Lefichach sasam yisalas hapesach hazeh. God closed off this door. The Tzivan commanded shelo yekayim shum oynish, no punishments. It needs to be that witnesses come and need to testify that they saw, and it has to be beirur she'ein by shum safek, has to be no doubt, not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but no doubt. What does that mean? Rambam is aware that in this model of Torah, basically, many murderers are going to get away with murder. Because how many times do you have a murderer who kills in front of two Edom with Asra? Never. Sagt the Rambam, a very famous line. V'yoser toy, v'yoser ratzoi. It is better and it is more desirable, liftar elef chaytim, to acquit 1,000 sinners, melaroi gnaki echad, to kill one person who is innocent. In other words, there's going to be a flaw. A system in this world, in Olam Hazeh, is going to have to be flawed. And the question is, in which direction do you want the flaw to be? You could have the flaw in a way where we get all our murderers, we get every single one of them is punished, along with some innocent people too, because we're going by circumstantial cases. Or you could have the opposite, that we have many murderers who are getting off, but at the same time, we're not killing any of them in a way that they're innocent. No innocents are being killed. So which one is better? Every society has to decide for itself which one it wants to do, right? And you could be somewhere in the middle. The Rambam says that Torah's approach is we rather have people getting away with murder, because the idea that a Bezdin, God's representatives on this earth, who are there for Mishpat Emes, Mishpat Torah, for them to be involved in a judicial killing that shouldn't have happened, that's a no-no, that should never happen, that's not something that's tolerable. And this is the reason why we have these rules and regulations in Torah that make it very difficult to put someone to death. So therefore, we all know this idea that the death penalty, very, very difficult to say that we're going to have it. And nonetheless, we see that in the Tshuva Maram Lublin, they're talking about a death penalty. And I can guarantee you, there was no two witnesses and Hasra in that particular case that saw the thing. There was no two witnesses. And definitely there was no Hasra in that case. So what's going on over here? On the one hand, we see this high standard. On the other hand, the Maram and the Reb Shmuel seem to be ignoring this standard. That's number one. Number two, there's another thing here. And that is, isn't it the case that in order to do the death penalty, you need to have the Sanhedrin? Look what the Rambam says in Hilchos Sanhedrin, also today's Rambam, in Perek Echad, Perek Yudal. He says as follows, Ein dani dinei nefashos ela b'fnei habayis. We only do dinei nefashos when the Beis HaMikdash exists. And that itself is not enough. You need to have the Bezdin in the Lishkas HaGazis, sitting in the proper place. And if they're not there, so then no Bezdin could execute. It's important to realize that any Bezdin of Chav Gimel could do Dinei Nefashis. Any Bezdin of Chav Gimel, it doesn't have to be Dafke the highest court. Any Bezdin of Chav Gimel in Eretz Yisrael could do it. However, they can only act when the Sanhedrin is sitting in the Lishkas HaGazis. The Rambam continues and says, Arba'im Shana Koidem Churbe Bayesheni, 40 years before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Batul Din in Nefashis Misrael. The Sanhedrin stopped doing executions. Why is that? Mipnei Shagalu HaSanhedrin, the Sanhedrin self-exiled. They left the Lishkas HaGazis, V'loi Hayu Sham B'mkayma B'mikdash, and they weren't there anymore. Hey Bazai, you need to have the Sanhedrin. Clearly, in the years 1615, by all accounts, we didn't have the Sanhedrin. And so therefore, and we didn't even have smicha to enable someone to be on the Sanhedrin, but for sure we didn't have the Sanhedrin, we sure didn't have the Sanhedrin to be in the Mekamon Balishkas HaGazis. And nonetheless, there's a conversation going on over here about the conversation about the possibility of using the death penalty. So what's going on over here? So what's going on is that along with this truth, there's a second truth. We're not going to deny anything that we said just now. Everything that we said till now is true, but there's also a second truth. An interesting way of being introduced to the second truth comes from the Sefer Shevet Yehuda. Shevet Yehuda. The Sefer Shevet Yehuda was written sometime in the 1500s. It was by a Jew. His name was Shlomo ibn Virga. And he was in Spain, and he was part of the exile of Spain in 1492, and then he settled in different countries. And he wrote a book on Jewish history during the 1500s. B'chlal, it's interesting, there's a number of Svarim on Jewish history that were written during this century. And he's part of this movement, and it's called Shevet Yehuda. And in the Sefer, he breaks it down into Shmodos, persecutions. So we're going to be reading now from Shmad Mem Aleph, from persecution 41. And basically, he has over there the following conversation, which I'll summarize. He has over there an instance in where there's some page row. We don't have any information about this event that he's talking about from any other place other than this book, this work. Where there's a pope, he gives a name, but it's hard to know who that is. It's hard to link him to any known pope. He gives the name of a pope and a page row who accuses Jews in front of the Pope, and the rabbis have to come and defend against the accusations. So this man Pedro quotes the Gemara. There's a teaching that's from Chazal. It's in different places. There's Talmud Yerushalmi, it's Masechah Sofrim, that says, Toiv shebegoyim haroig. Wow, what a teaching. Toiv shebegoyim haroig. How are you supposed to understand that? The best of the Gentiles should be killed? What does this mean? So he raised this and says, this is what it says in your books. It says in your books, defend it. So at first they said, well, it comes from the Agadata, it comes from the non-legal sections of the Gemara, and so those aren't as important, so we don't need to defend it. The Pope said, no, you need to defend it. If it's in your book, you need to defend it. So they came up with a very creative explanation. They said as follows. They said the meaning is as follows. In the Gemara, we quoted before the Rambam. The Rambam says if a if a Bezdin kills once in 7 years, they're called Chavlonim. Why are they called Chavlonim? Because the standards are so difficult. If you did 2, then you're doing something wrong. Something's wrong in your procedures, right? So the Rambam brings that. That's the shita of the Tanakam. The emissaries are other shittas. The Rambam passes like the Tanakama, so he says 7 years. There are other shittas. There's a shitta of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah who says 1 in 70 years. Same svara, but he's saying 1 in 70 years. Then there's Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon come along and say that if we were in the Sanhedrin, no one would ever be executed. Why? Because in a case of murder, what we would say is, your 2 witnesses, you saw, you did everything. How do you know that the victim of the murder wasn't a treifa? Maybe he was about to die. He had some internal illness that he was mamish about to die. Did you see not? I'm going to say no. So I'm going to say, okay, so then I can't execute the murder. This is what Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon were going to say. So they quoted all this to the Pope. And they said, we all understand that if you have this standard, this rigorous standard of evidence, it's going to be very hard to run a normal society because murderers are going to get away with murder. So that's a problem, right? Now you can understand what Chazal said when they said Toiv Shebegoyim Haroi. What's good about the Toiv Shebegoyim? What's good in the realm of Goyim? What do they do well that is in contrast to what it says in our books? Is a Haroi. Is that they'll go and they'll kill the person when there's a strong circumstantial case, and that's good. Why is that good? Because it's justice. It's justice. This is the answer that they gave the thing. So it's either that the best Gentiles, have a lower standard of evidence, haroic, and therefore they get rid of the murders, or it's Toiv Shebegoyim. What's good about the Gentiles is they don't have our rigorous standard. Okay, obviously this is not the original shot of what was meant. What was meant, but Pashtus, it's referring to during a time of war, but it's not our topic today to get into the discussion of what is it meaning there. Much has been said about it. The reason I'm quoting from this disputation in Shevet Yehuda is because I want to bring out the point that we all understand that when we read this very, very rigorous standard in halacha, we're like, okay, this doesn't really work. How is this supposed to work? And already Chazal therefore spoke about the fact that alongside this very rigorous standard, there also needs to be another standard. And that's the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Mem Vav, Amid Aleph. What does the Gemara in Sanhedrin say? That Belazar ben Yaakov Eimer. Shamaiti, I have a tradition from my teachers. Shebeisdin, Makin, V'oinshin, Shalom, and HaTorah. Bezdin has the ability to strike and to punish, even when there is no allowance min HaTorah to do it. Not that it's okay for rabbis or a bezdin to violate the words of Torah. No, it's kedei lasis yagla Torah. It's in order to protect the Torah. And then it gives two examples. There was a Jew who rode a horse on Shabbos in the days of the Greek persecutions. Now, there is no Isser D'Oraisa to ride an animal on Shabbos. It's an Isser D'Rabbanan because there is a fear that maybe you're going to come to tear off a branch while you're leading the animal. So clearly, there is no death penalty for violating Isser D'Rabbanan. Nonetheless, they brought this man to Bezdin, uskaluhu, and they gave him skila. They killed him. Not that the law is that he deserves it, because that can't change. And the din is that he doesn't deserve it. The time demanded it. What does it mean the time demanded it? The time, it says it was b'mei Yevonim. Jews were being persecuted. There was a lot of assimilation going on. A point had to be made. There was a man who had relations with his wife under a fig tree in public. They brought him to Bezdin. V'hilkuhu, and they gave him malchus. There is no malchus min HaTorah for doing an act like that. Lo mipnei sharoi lekach, not because the din is that he deserved it. Elo sha'ashat tzrich lekach, the time demanded it. So what do you see over here from Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov? All of a sudden we see that alongside the fact that there's a standard that would allow these two people to go away without any punishment, the Bezdin came along and gave them a punishment. What does that show us? That shows us there's what we would call the din Torah, and then there's what we would call hayra hasha. The Rambam calls it hayra hasha. Hasha tzricha lekach. The time demanded that we, so to speak, have another type of system. And this system, by the way, were there two witnesses? Lav dafka, there were two witnesses in any of this system. Was there a hasra in any of these cases? Some of the Mefarshim say clearly that there wasn't a hasra in these cases. Why? Because we're not working within that framework of that very rigorous framework anymore. By the way, an interesting note on the person who had relations with his wife under the fig tree. Our Gemara says that he received malchus. But the truth is, there are other prints. If you go back to the Bamberg printing of the Gemara in the 1500s, there it says that he too was killed, which is much more serious. He too was killed. And then, if you go to the Munich manuscript, we spoke about this last year in different classes, this is the fullest, the only complete Ksav Yad of Shas from the 1300s. There, so I checked it today, it says Hilkuhu, that he gave a malchus, but you're able to see that it was erased, and that previously it said something else. So I think that leads us to assume that it once said over there that he too was killed. So there's different girses. Clearly there's different girses in the Gemara about what happened to him. It's not a question of censorship. It was just that some people felt that this is the right girsa, this girsa. I don't think it's a question of censorship. So now like this. So what do we see here? We have another system. Accordingly, we come with a shaila. What's the obvious shaila? So hold on a second. Why is the Torah system so rigorous, which then forces the Chachamim to say that, by the way, there's another system that we are able to use to kind of patch the flaw in the first system? This is a very, very good question, very important question. It's a legal question, it's also a philosophical question of how Torah looks at punishment and how Torah's unique way of punishment led it to this, and therefore it required the rabbis to come up with another system of punishment to have alongside it, but that's not our topic for today, so I'm just going to leave it as a question. You can think about it on your own. Maybe we could talk about it later. It's not going to be our topic now. Where we need to go now is say, all of a sudden, I realized that we said that why is Maharam Lublin and Reb Shmuel talking about a death sentence in the year 1615? We're starting to see the beginning of what system they're talking about this under. They're not talking about this under the rigorous Torah system. They're talking about it under the second system. And now you come to the shaila. What's the shaila? Does that second system operate in Lublin, in Poland, in the year 1615? Or maybe you say, yeah, there is that second system, but especially if you want to do din and a fascist within that second system, it's only when you have a Sanhedrin. So that's the next part of the shir, to look at this discussion. Because the Reb Shmuel wrote to Maharam Lublin that he is not comfortable with the death penalty today. He doesn't know that Rabbanim today have that power. Well, Maharam Lublin felt that they do have that power. So that's the discussion. So Maharam Lublin brings from Rabbeinu Yerucham. And Rabbeinu Yerucham is commenting on the Gemara that we just read, on Sanhedrin Daf Memvav, where Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov brought an example of two people who were killed, even though the law wasn't. And the reason I say two people is because Rabbeinu Yerucham also, in his version, does not have the second person receiving lashes. He has the second person being killed. Says Rabbeinu Yerucham, "V'chol zeh afilu b'chutz haaretz." This also applies outside Eretz Yisrael. V'afilu b'lo hasra, even without warning, as I alluded to earlier. And he brings proof from the Gemara and Baba Kama. What's the proof from the Gemara and Baba Kama? So let's read Baba Kama Tzadik Vav Amid Beis. Says the Gemara, Hahu Gavra. There was a certain man, the Gazal Padna the Ture Mechavre, who stole a pair of oxen from his friend. And I'll continue summarizing outside. He went and he plowed a field of his with the stolen oxen. But then he returned the ox. And then the field yielded wonderful from the fact that he benefited from the ox. Now he was sued. The Ganav was sued. Rab Nachman paskined and ruled that we need to assess how much the value of his land was benefited from this cow, and this guy needs to pay the difference. So the students were there and saying, what are you talking about? So he's a Ganav. A Ganav has to return the Gzela. Where do we see? In Torah, you don't have this idea that you took Gzela, you benefited, so your margin of benefit was a certain percentage, so therefore that you need to give to the victim of the theft. We don't have that in Torah. So Rav Nachman answered, Hai inish gazalna atikahu. He is an ancient, a seasoned, a veteran Ganav. Uvaina de'ikna say he needs to get punished. He needs to get punished. Now, so what happened here? This is clearly not the Torah system. Here we stepped out of the Torah system into the Hoyrah Shah system. Why? Rav Nachman felt that this person needed to learn a lesson. Under the Torah rules, it's just Veheshav Sagzela, which he already did. We need to do something extra. So he unleashed the second system. Where? In Bavel. Rav Nachman's in Bavel. He's not in Eretz Yisrael. There's no link to Sanhedrin. There's no Sanhedrin in Bavel. So in other words, what do we see here? We see that even outside Eretz Yisrael, even without a Sanhedrin, we have the ability to invoke this second thing. Now the truth is, this is not a case of dinin nefashos. This is a case of forcing the person to pay. But notice what Rabbeinu Yerucham did. Rabbeinu Yerucham made a link between the Gemara that says we're killing, and he linked it to this Gemara in Baba Kama. Clearly Rabbeinu Yerucham thinks that a Rav in his day, he lived between 1290 and 1360, he's one of the Rishonim, who wrote Halacha Sefer. So he felt that in his day, this was something that theoretically was possible. We get the same thing from the Tur. The Tur in Choshen Mishpat Simin Tov Chav Hey says as follows. He quotes from Vaharav Nitrunoi Goy. He was one of the Goinim in Surah that lived in the 9th century, and he wrote as follows. Da'akol Chayave Mises Bezdin regarding those who need to be executed by Bezdin, ha'idna, today, we don't have permission to do malchus, there's no galus, and there's no execution. What do? We excommunicate. We're allowed to do non-Torah based malchus, and we separate him from the people. Okay, so this sounds like there's no such a thing as extrajudicial type of punishments. No, says the Torah, the Efsher Shaloi Kasav Kain Elametzad Adin. When Rav Neturnoi Goin was writing this, he was writing about the first system, the Torah system. The Vadai Ein Biyadenu Laduno. Indeed, you do not have the permission in the 9th century in Bavel to use the Torah system of punishment. However, the second system, when we need to do something in order to set up a gate, Migdar Milsa, set up a gate, which is the name of the second system, Bazel like Dibar, Rav Neturnoi Goin wasn't talking about it. Kimi Chaylak Rabbi Elazar, who's arguing on Rabbi Elazar, Sha'amar Bezin Makin V'Unchin Kedei Lases Gather, who says that they're allowed to punish and strike in order to make a gather. So clearly you see here, the Tur, right? He's living in the 1300s in Spain, and he's basically saying that the power that Rabbi Elazar was talking about was relevant for Rav Neturnoi Goin. When Rav Neturnoi Goin excluded himself from execution, he only meant it in the sense of the first system, the Torah system. He never meant it in the sense of the Migdar Milsa systems. Here you see two Rishonim, Rabbeinu Yerucham and the Tur, who seem very comfortable, at least somewhat comfortable, with the idea of taking that Gemara in Sanhedrin Mem Vav Amud Aleph and saying it 100% applies in Bavel, it applies in Spain, it applies in Provence, where Rabbeinu Yerucham lived, without a problem. However, Reb Shmuel, the person who had written to Maharam Lublin, he wasn't so sure about this. And he quoted a Gemara to argue that the second system exists. And not only the second system exists, it exists today, but not for Dinei Nefashis. He was not comfortable for the second system to be used for Dinei Nefashis in his day in 1615 in Poland. What Gemara did he bring? The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, there was a man named Bar Chama, and he katal nafsha, he murdered. Amar le reish galusa l'Rav Abba Bar Yaakov. You had, in the times of the Gemara, there was the political leader of the Jews. His name was the reish galusa. This was a very prestigious position to have, and there were different. Some of these reish galusas were scholars, some of them were less scholarly. Each one had his own biography. Anyway, so the reish galusa at the time told Rav Abba Bar Yaakov, Poik ayimba, he called in the great rabbi, and he said, investigate the case. Ivadai katal, if indeed it is certain that he did the murder, lichiyuhu le'ene, you should blind his eye. Says Reb Meir, doesn't say kill him. It doesn't say kill a murderer. Murderers are supposed to be killed, right? Doesn't say kill him. It says blind his eye. What does that tell you? That tells you that if you're not a Sanhedrin, you don't have the right. Yeah, the second system exists, but not for murder, not for execution. That we don't have the ability. Well, Maharam Lublin did not buy that argument. He's going to defend the right of Jews in Poland to use the death sentence. Said Maharam Lublin, no. The reason in that case where he said, Ivadai katal, if it certainly happened, then you should blind him, is because there isn't what he calls an eidos gemura. Don't have an eidos gemura. In other words, it's only circumstantial evidence. Because there's only circumstantial evidence, and therefore he said, I don't want the murder to happen. But if you would have had an eidos gemura, you would have had a high standard. It doesn't really clarify the mamish, but he does use the words eidos gemura al pi ha-Torah. So it sounds like two adult witnesses who saw it, and if you don't have a circumstantial case, then you have the right to go ahead and use the death penalty today. And then he concludes this section of the tshuva as follows. Let's read number 14. I think it's simple. And halacha and lamaisa. Sheyesh koyach lebeis din afilu bizman hazeh lahanish ba'oinish misa. They can use the death penalty mishum tzorech hasha if the time needs it. Afilu b'shar averis. This is true even if it's a regular avera. Chosha came ba'oven eretzicha, definitely if it's murder. Sharoi lahachmer yoselanish. Here we need to be more careful about this. Mipnei tzorech hasha if the time requires it. Why do we need to be more careful about murder? Mipnei sheyesh ba shchasas yeshuva shalaylam. This destroys living a normal life. You can't run a society if murder is happening. Mele, if people are doing other averas, fine. But this really ruins everything. And so therefore, this could be used. Unlike what you were saying that we don't have this right. What's interesting is something that's for the Shmuel's, we don't have what he wrote. We don't have what he wrote. But one of the things that he probably wrote in his Shuvah is if you go up and down the entire Talmud Bavli, you're not going to find one case where the Reish Galusa or an Amoira put someone to death. You're not going to find it. Okay, we saw one example. We saw they did some sort of corporal punishment. So I think Maharam Lublin would answer, yeah, maybe because the government didn't give them permission. So if you can't, you can't. But Remeir would say, no, maybe it was internal. Maybe because you don't have that right to take a life. You know how serious that is. That's only the Sanhedrin, even within the second system. Okay, let's continue and now move to the next part of the tshuva. What's the next part of the tshuva? The next part of the tshuva asks a simple question. What does this mean, Soyrech Hasha? What is Soyrech Hasha? The whole time we're using the word, if time requires it. What does it mean, Soyrech Hasha? So here too, there was a disagreement between Reb Meir and Maharam Lublin. What was Reb Shmuel and Maharam Lublin. What was the difference? Reb Shmuel wanted to say, Soyrech Hasha means that the crime is already rampant. It is already rampant. Meaning, the Rabbanim look at it and they're like, oh my God, this didn't just happen once. Everyone is doing this. Okay, we need to put an end to this. And so then we're going to do Makin v'Onshin Shalom min Adin. That's called Migdar Milsa. Lasis Yag. What does it mean to make a gate? Makes it because many people are violating this. Says Maharam Lublin, no, I disagree with you about this too. Look at number 15. Nirali Pashut. Shaloi levadze b'shekvar rabim miklala trutzim ba'oisa aveirahu nikra tzorech shah. Don't tell me that tzorech shah means that already many people are doing this. K'moi she'ala al dait chakein, which is what you think. Umitam zeh, for this reason, charatzta din, you wanted to rule shebenidan zeh, that in your case, lo shayech loimer b'oisha shah tzrich lekach. You can't say that time needs it. Why? How many murders did you have in Premishal in 1615? You did not have many. There weren't. So the mayor is like, we can't say Ashat Tzrich Lekach. That's what the Reb Shmuel was saying. V'zeh eino, he says, Maharam Lublin, no, you're wrong. Even if in the past it isn't rampant, but if if the bezdin sees Shem lo yasu zeh bedina rabba kamisa, that if we don't do a severe punishment like death, Siba, that's going to be caused that in the future that the people are going to start committing this sin and they're going to treat it lightly. This also is called Hashat Tzrich Lekach. It does not have to be retroactive, looking backward. It could be prospective, looking forward. Now he brings a raya. What's the raya? He brings a raya from the tshuva of the Rosh. In other words, he doesn't have a Gemara to cite here. Doesn't have a Gemara. So he brings a raya from the tshuva of the Rosh. Very interesting tshuva from the Rosh. A sad tshuva. So what's the Maisa? So let's see the Maisa. She'ira bekan Cordova. The Rosh didn't live in Cordova, but the Shaila was being sent from Cordova. What was the Maisa in Cordova? Me'ura kasha ad ma'oid, a terrible story. She'novel echad me'anavalim. There was a novel, bad guy, and nechbash al tfiyo shetfa'u kusim. He was incarcerated because of a monetary debt that he owed to non-Jews. There's something called debtor's prison. If you owed money, so he ended up in debtor's prison. He owed a non-Jew money, he ended up in this prison. Ultimately, and then he made some sort of pshara and they let him out of jail. So his friends came over to him to make him feel better now that he got out of jail. He came out of the house. They didn't go into the house. That's interesting. Something to think about. Don't you meet your friend inside their house? All right. Maybe a previous shir that we gave maybe answers that question. They started talking to him. And one of them said, Baruch, mater asurim, thank God you got out of jail. Well, he cursed God. Cursed God. This is a serious isser. And he violated that isser. And he's a difficult person, and he's an evil person. No, Ask anyone to say something nice about him, right? Even that, like the famous joke, his brother was worse. Even that you didn't have. So also shaila here. The shaila is what they should do with him. They incarcerated him, they arrested him. And the shaila was, what should we do with this person who did this very, very serious offense? Tshuva. Says the Rosh. Wow, you took this major step to ask me a question, din nefashos. In other words, what did they ask the Rosh? They asked the Rosh whether they should execute this person for this sin. Zok the Rosh. For all normal lands that I know of, ain't done a din nefashos. We don't do din nefashos. Only here in Spain, Jewish community is engaged in din nefashos. And when I came here, I was very bewildered by this. The Rosh began his life in Germany. He was a Talmud Am Rottenburg. And sometime in the 1290s, life wasn't working out. And that's when Maram Rottenburg was arrested. So that's when the Rosh moved to Spain. So when I come here, I'm like, what's going on over here? The Baalei HaTosfos did not get involved in this. Rashi did not get involved in this. It's really important to recognize that each place had a different situation. The Rishonim of Ashkenaz, they didn't use din nefashos. The Rishonim in Svar, they were using din nefashos, right? Remember the Tur? The Tur is the Rosh's son, who we went out of his way to say this is okay, right? We understand why, because he was living in Spain where it was okay. The Rosh says, I was very surprised by this. How can you do this without Sanhedrin? The Rosh knows about the fact that there's two systems. There's a strict Torah system and there's the less rigid Migdar Milsa system. But even that, he feels that for executing, that needs to be with the Sanhedrin. So Amruli, when I inquired about this, they told me, Hormana Damaku, this is what the king wants. In other words, the non-Jewish Spanish government wants that the Jewish people should do this. And so therefore it's being done. It's almost like it's like the shlichus of the non-Jewish government. Okay, so maybe I felt a little better. V'gam, another argument that was given to justify this is ha'eda shoiftim lahatzil. When the Jewish community does this, the judges are more lenient and they try to save the accused Jew. Many more lives would have been lost if the Arabs, Cordova is a Muslim, even during the Rosh's time, Cordova is still Muslim at the time. So many more people would have been killed if the Muslims were doing the court case. So I let people do what they wanted. But I never really came to terms and agreed with this. So the Rosh, by the way, now we have two. We have the Reb Meir, who's corresponding with the Maram Lublin, who's not comfortable with din nefashos. And I mentioned the fact that there is no clear mention of the Gemara of a non-Sanhedrin using it even in the Migdar Milsa system. And here we see now that kind of the Rosh is on that side as well. So it basically turns out that we have a machlokes over here. But let's continue. So I'm uncomfortable with the fact that you want to do din nefashos. However, all of you, the entire Jewish community in Cordova, you want to get rid of this guy. Definitely, he desecrated God's name in public. And the Muslims have already heard about this. And look what he says, an interesting line. They are very careful. If you're going to speak out against their faith or something like that, which is what this Jew did, he was Mekalo, the Eibishter. The Muslims are very, very careful about this. So the Chilul Hashem is going to be much greater if the Jewish community lets it go. What are the Muslims going to say? Look, you don't take your religion seriously. Umatzinu, and now he quotes the Gemara, Bishvil Migdar Milsa, there is this concept of Migdar Milsa, and we find that Satlu Lemisha Rachav, Asus B'Shabbos, the Bezdin executed someone who rode on his horse on Shabbos. That was the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Mem Vav. And so therefore, despite the fact that a few lines above I said I'm not comfortable with this and I don't like this and I never agree with it, but in this case over here, because of the Chilul Hashem that was here, and because of Ma Yoimru HaYishmaelim, so therefore, Asu Boy Katoy Beinechem, if you want, I'm going to let you, you can execute him. But then he continues and he says the following. If I was part of your council, my opinion still fart. I'm not comfortable with the death sentence. So this is a little hard to read, but what is he saying here? To take off his tongue. taking off a majority of his tongue, so he shouldn't have the ability to speak. And that's going to be retribution for what he did. And this is a very common form of punishment that is being done for everyone in Cordova, right? Because the idea of corporal punishment, to remove a bodily limb, very, very foreign to us today. And in Din Torah, it's completely foreign, right? Ayin tachas ayin in Din Torah, no such a thing as removing a limb. But in the second system, is it open to that? Yeah, the second system, Migdar Milsa, is open to that, and he uses the argument that that's how the Muslims punish for this type of thing. So it's like ba'ofen hamiskabel. So you can go along with that. So you see a certain discomfort that the Rosh has with using the death penalty. That becomes very, very clear. But at the end of the day, he allowed it. So now, why is all of this relevant? Before I say why it's relevant, let me just point out the paragraph that we just read that spoke about the cutting off of the tongue. When this tshuva was printed in Vilna in 1885, this paragraph was taken out. Okay, so far I told you about two different censorships. The tshuva Kuf Nun Hey from Kuf Lamed Ches from Maharam Lublin, the whole tshuva that we're learning was taken out in the Russian prints. This paragraph from Tshuvas Harash about removing the tongue was also taken out when it was printed in Russia in 1885. Now, why was this tshuva of the Rush necessary? Why did we bring it? Because Maharam Lublin wants to say, hold on a second. Was it all Jews in Cordova, when this happened sometime in the 1300s, all Jews in Cordova were being Mekallel the Eibishter, they were cursing God? No, it was 1 in a million. And Afal became, the Rush allowed Migdar Milsa to be invoked. That proves that you don't have to wait and say, oh, we have a communal crisis that everyone's involved in this sin, and now we have to say, okay, we can come in, which is what the Shmuel wanted to say. No, you don't have to do that. Why? You have the right to invoke it even if there isn't Migdar Milsa. He goes and says, the reason he was allowed over here was because of Kiddush Hashem, to avoid a Chilul Hashem, and also to make sure that nothing happens in the future. So this is the evidence that he brings. You don't have to wait for a crisis to already develop. Then he makes another point. He says, by the way, I want to say something else. What if you don't have any concern, not in the past and not in the future, of their turning into a communal crisis that everyone's going to start doing the sin? Ella, Bezdin sees that this guy is used to, has the habit of doing this Aveda. Then he definitely will do it again. And this will affect other people. The Gemara shows us that he too is allowed to be punished. And he goes back to that Gemara of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, why did he punish the Gazlan in a way that's not al pi Torah, Gazalna Atika, because he is a veteran Ganiv, Uva Ina Dikna say, I want to punish him. The Rav Nachman say, oh, because so many people are stealing, and so therefore we need to protect. No. Did he say, oh, I'm worried that if I don't punish him, then in the future, a lot of people are going to start stealing? No, he didn't talk about a lot of people at all, not for past, present, or future. What did he say? This guy is a veteran Ganiv. This guy needs to learn a lesson because we need to protect people. And so Maharam Lublin says that also works under Migdar Milsa. So basically, it's really anything. We have so far seen what I would think is 4 different categories. Category 1, a lot of people are doing this Aveda, we need to make a statement. Category 2, I'm afraid that in the future a lot of people are going to do this Aveda, we need to make a statement. Category 3, Chilul Hashem. What are the non-Jews going to say? Are they going to say, hey, you don't take this thing seriously? That's another factor that needs to be, Migdar Milsa. And number 4, this guy is going to do it again. He's going to cause harm to other people. That in itself is enough of a Seder Chasha that would allow us to do. Now there's another issue that came up in this tshuva. And that is whether the severity of the crime matters. Whether the severity of the crime matters. In other words, we all know murder is murder. But sometimes there's a case of a murder that makes your blood boil. Like, you hear what that guy did? And sometimes your blood doesn't boil as much. Why? Because of the circumstances of the case, and how it's done has an emotional impact on whether we're outraged to the 10th degree or only to the 9th degree. So the shaila came up. Why? Because in this case, it was really bad. The case in 1615 was a really bad murder. We don't know exactly the details, but it was the whole community was outraged that something happened. And so the question is, should that communal outrage play a role here and lead us to say that the death sentence should be employed. So you already know what's going to happen. Reb Shmuel said, no, the outrage should play no role. Why? A very simple argument. The Gemara's point is tzorech hasha. The time, are we concerned that this is going to turn into a crisis? So what does that have to do with how wicked the criminal was and how outraged the community is? There's nothing to do. There's one thing that you need to look at. The only thing you need to look at is there a tzorech hasha because of the rabbim that are going to end up, because the rabbim were already, in his view, doing this sin. Well, Maram Lublin disagreed with that. Let's read, and what evidence did he have to disagree with that? So here he brought another tshuva from the Rishon. Here he brought a tshuva from the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshes. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshes lived late 1300s, early 1400s. We're reading now number 20. And he also dealt with a case. He also dealt with a similar type of case. And when we read it, we're going to see that actually communal outrage does matter. We'll see that the Rivash is going to say, well, if it's a really, really bad crime, then we'll be more inclined to do dinin nefashos. Let's read. The case we don't have for the Rivash, but this is what it says in the Shur. Even when we're in the system, the second system, the tzorech hasha system, we don't use the same punishment in all cases. It is more appropriate to punish if there's clear witnesses for the sin, but there is one aid, or if you're dealing with a case of amaslois. Amaslois often means excuses, but in the Gemara, what it means is strong arguments that justify a certain conclusion. That's what an amasla usually means. So what he's saying is you really need to look at the case and you need to see what standard of evidence you have. It makes more sense to punish when the standard of evidence is higher. And when the standard of evidence is weaker, then it makes less sense to punish. Okay, that's interesting, because we're working in our second system, and it's not really our topic for today, but the question is, within that second system, what standard of evidence is reasonable? What point would you say that's good evidence, and what would you say is not? In other words, we say beyond a reasonable doubt is what we say today. Well, what would the halachic line be that, if it reached that level, then kefit tzorech hasha, we're happy to go along and execute. And you see that he's getting involved. He's beginning that conversation by saying, actually, I would want a higher standard of evidence if we're going to be putting this person to death. Okay, continues the Rivash and says as follows. If you, whichever bezin he was talking, you want to kill the murderers, Kivin sha'asu came b'shat nefesh, because they did it in such a brazen way. B'yad ramo v'zadein, they did it b'mezid, k'moshe nireh, as it seems, sha'arvu loy b'layla. They ambushed this victim at night. V'gam b'yoyim b'farhesia, and during the day and in public, b'fnei tuvei akal, in front of the leaders of the community, hayu hochin, these murderers went b'chlei zayin, with their knives, probably, kenegdoi, against the victim. And so they're doing this in public. So they killed them at night in an ambush, and during the day they're displaying their strength in front of everyone. So this is a really bad crime. So harashus biyadcha, you know what? You have the ability to put these people to death. Even though there is no witnesses, but if there's rayos, chazakos, v'amaslois, amitiyos. Here's his standard. Here is his standard. I asked, what's the standard in the Migdar Milsa system? What is the standard to say I'm comfortable saying that murder happened? If you have strong proof and amaslois, which I translated as arguments that lead you to say that a certain conclusion is logical, amitios, and it sounds true. And if you want to be mekel, how would you be mekel? Lenient. Lakutz yad yaminam levad, to cut off their right arms. If you think that's enough, you have that ability, so you don't have to execute. You can do, again, within that second system, removing of a limb, especially Rivashes in North Africa, a Muslim country. This is a very, very common form of punishment. Jews saw it all the time. They all knew neighbors that suffered from that type of punishment. And so if you want to go ahead and you want to do that, you have the right. Now, I need to tell you, these words, lakutz yad yaminam levad, when the Tshuvas HaRivash, you already know what I'm going to say. When the Tshuvas HaRivash were printed in Russia in 1879. Those words were taken out and were replaced with other words that are ambiguous. Shvar Zroya Rama is a lashon of the pasuk in Iyov. So now you have 3 cases in where printings of tshuvas in Russia are getting censorship. Okay? Now let's continue. If I had, with the reshus of the king, the ability to be the judge, this is what I would do. In other words, I wouldn't kill, I would remove their right hand. But I would not be mekel more unless the victim's family want to have compassion. This opens a whole discussion that we don't have the ability to get into. And that is, in the Torah system, we don't care about what the family says. The Torah system says that a Ritzach needs to be killed. You can have the family of the victim say, no, keep the person alive. We say no. But here we're seeing that the Rivash is telling us that in the Migdar Milsa system, it's like everything is fair here. And here the conversation of, what does the family want? Does the family want more severe? Do they want less severe? That is a valid part of the Migdar Milsa system. Fascinating, and it really opens your mind to thinking about what this Migdar Milsa system would look about. Okay, why? But why? Why what? I'm asking now is why is it that if the reshus to do the execution is only for tzorech hasha, for the need, why should the level of the crime, the brazenness of the crime matter? We just saw in the Rivash that why, you see clearly he's taken into consideration, they walked with knives in public. Ooh, who cares? They walked with knives in public. They ambushed him at night. It's mamish rishis. Why does that matter? What should matter is tzorech hasha. And that was the argument of Reb Shmuel. Comes Maram Lublin and explains, no, because it's all ha'ba'ataya, it all affects. When a crime is more brazen, more wicked, so then the concern that this could turn into a communal crisis that other people say, I could get away with crime, becomes bigger. And so therefore it's all part of the tzorech hasha, and therefore you do want to look at the specifics of the case, and you want to see how wicked the murderers were, and that will play a role in the way this is going to be assessed. And so now we come to the end of the tshuva of Maram Lublin, and now let's read inside what he has to say. Va'ata ahuvi, and so therefore my friend, Benidan Didan, Reb Shmuel, b'maisa mechor aniskar, about this terrible incident. Haloi anoichi mi bachutz. I am outside. This happened by you in Premishul. Va'ata mi bifnim, you're there. Lishko b'moizne sichlechem, you have to judge with your mind, goydol tzorech hasha, to what degree there is really a need, but al pi adrocha mashar kasafti, according to my more liberal understanding of what tzorech hasha is, you need to judge whether it reaches that level. So in other words, to say, murder, the person murdered, so automatically he needs to die. No, it's not automatically he needs to die. It needs to be tzorech hasha, and you need to evaluate tzorech hasha. Now we saw there's a very conservative tzorech hasha. That is, a lot of murders are already happening, and so we need to make a statement. No, Maram Lublin saying a more liberal understanding of tzorech hasha, which includes what's going to be in the future, and are we afraid this person is going to do it again, and is there going to be a chilul Hashem? Let's continue. It seems to me, all of the concerns about what may happen in the future, all of them are here. In other words, the past the concern that in the present right now there's a lot of murders, we all agree there isn't. But I open the door for the looking into the future, and that is a concern here, it seems to me. How much more so? You mentioned last year in 1614. In your territory, something like this happened. And this Jew got away with murder. So indeed, we have to be worried that we don't want to set a trend over here and start a new norm. In addition, because all the non-Jews know about this murder, and this suspected murderer is actually sitting incarcerated amongst the Gentiles. If we leave him alive, it's going to be a chilul Hashem. Which was what the Rush said. And that was why I said it's one of the criteria of tzorech hasha. Is this going to be a chilul Hashem? The Rush used that, and Maram Lublin is mirroring that concern. Then he goes and says another interesting point. There's another issue. Sometimes a Gentile kills a Jew. Then the Jewish community goes to the local Polish nobleman and says, "Oh, you killed one of us. You have to go and execute him." And then what happens? The Paritz is going to turn around and is going to say, "And what happened last year when Yankel killed Shmerel? You let him off. He's still hanging out in your community. That's okay. We're going to let this guy go." So that's his concern about if we don't invoke the death penalty in this case. Okay. Now we already know that Reb Shmuel did not want to invoke the death penalty. He came up with multiple arguments against it. And so in his writing to Maram, he wrote, you know what? Maybe let's remove a limb. And look, the Rivash leaned in that direction. The Rosh leaned in that direction. And again, we have the Gemara. It was a murder and it was blinding of the eye also. So you see, there's a certain case that could be made that we should not do din in nefashis, even in Migdar Milsa, and just do the removal of a limb. Maram Lublin says, Loi mitakraisa aleph, we're not doing this. Why? Not because he disagreed that there is the ability in Migdar Milsa to do it. It is true, ayin tachas ayin is not kipshutoy, but that's only in the Torah system. Outside the Torah system, in the Migdar Milsa system, we can do it. So why not? So look what he says. Look at this. You say that maybe we should remove his limbs or some of his limbs. So you're going to breed a huge problem. What's going to happen? He's going to convert. And he's going to be a pest. He's going to be a thorn for Jews. The son of Yisrael here is a metaphor. Why do I think that way? Well, because there's precedent. First of all, it could just be, look what the Jewish community did to me. Jewish community took off my aver, so you get very upset at the people who did that, and you join the other team, and then, right? And he says, in fact, this happened once. Kasher zachruni bimei charfi. I remember from my younger years what I think this means, what I heard, she'ira bimei hagoin moireinu arav Reb Shachna. So one of the great Gdolim in Poland, his dates are 1495 to 1558. He passed away the same time that Maram Lublin was born. So Maram Lublin never saw him or spoke to him. But his name was Reb Shachna. He never wrote any Sfarim. But he was like the Rebbe the Ramah, a very, very important Rav in Poland. In his day, there was a bad person. And Reb Shachna allowed for his eyes to be removed. For his tongue to be removed. And after that, what happened? He converted. He married a non-Jewish woman. He had non-Jewish children. And they pestered us, causing us pain. Doesn't give details of what happened here, but you could understand exactly what happened here. That anger. You did that to me? And so therefore, he's like, this is a terrible thing to basically do something so horrific to a human being, though we know it happened before. But now we realize this is a terrible idea because it's just going to turn them against us. And so therefore, you see, Maram Lublin is basically saying we should invoke the power that we have. And that is to do the death penalty. However, at the last second, at the end of the tshuva, he backs off and says, you know something, we don't have to. Why? Because we have a different solution here. Look what he says in the last paragraph. Because he anyway is incarcerated by the non-Jews. So if you want to do the best thing, Yad Beis Yisrael lo yeh. Jewish court shouldn't touch him. Ragoy ale Adam, the victim's family, Yitbu Mimenu, should sue. Nikmas dam hanishbach hayedei apkid. They should go to the Paritz. They should go to the nobleman, and they should say, "We want the murderer to be killed." Sheyavarenu min ha'olam, and this way, Chol Yisrael Yunikim, we could wipe our hands clean from this. He says this is the best. So basically, he's happy. He's okay. You invoking the power of the Beis for the murder, for execution. But he just said, you know something, we have a better option in this particular case. Okay, so now like this. Fascinating tshuva, sad tshuva, fascinating tshuva. There were 3 instances in where the Russians, when there was Svarim printed in Russia, took out. The whole tshuva Maram Lublin was taken out. The tshuva of the Rivash lines were taken out. The tshuva of the Rosh, also a paragraph was removed. What's happening here? So, if you remember, it's Mamish last year. Last year, there was a new Gilui that came out where they found in the library here, actually not in the library, it's in Eretz Yisrael, but it was here in the library, there's copies of it, of a ksav of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch that's pre-print. We gave a whole share, and I think it's one of the first shiurim that's up on the podcast. Anyway, one of the interesting things is in our Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it says that any person who has gasus haruach is ka'ashera. He's like an ashera. That's very difficult to understand what the Alter Rebbe means, because the Gemara says that a person who has gasus haruach is roi legodoi ka'ashera, deserves to be uprooted like an ashera. Just like we all understand an avodah zarah and ashera should be uprooted, so someone who has gasus haruach roi legodoi ka'ashera. What does Alter Rebbe mean when he says roi? That he is kasher. You have gas haruach, you like kasher. It doesn't say that anywhere in Chazal. Well, in this ksav, it turns out that in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Taka did say roi legode kasher. And the reason the prints say he's an ashera is because the Russian censor didn't like it and they didn't let it being printed. Why? It's very simple. When the Jews were in Poland, you already see from here they had tremendous amount of autonomy, and they were able to excommunicate. That was easy. They were able to do. In addition to that, they were able to do corporal punishment. Not only corporal punishment, they were able to execute. Then what happened was that in the 1770s, Russia took a major part of Poland. Major part of Poland they took. One of the first things the Russians did to the Jewish community is they stripped the community of this power. Vard Arba Aratzes, which was this political body that had control of the Jewish community, was stripped of all of these powers. And the Russians were extremely sensitive to the idea that even a cherem they couldn't do. Alachas kam v'kama, a corporal punishment, or putting someone in jail, or anything like that, which the earlier centuries Jews in Poland had the right to do, was stripped and taken away. And that's why a text, a Jewish law that says a person should be uprooted, depending on who the censor was and how strict he wanted to be that day, and sometimes it was also self-censorship, where the people involved in the Sfarim themselves decided to just change it in order to avoid any problems. So yeah, that's a problematic text. And likewise, tshuva, this whole tshuva of Maharam was taken out of the Russian prince, and the tshuva of the Rivash and the tshuva of the Rush. Anytime you had this idea of some sort of corporal punishment, the Russian government was very, very sensitive to this. That's why it's taken out of these places. So now like this, after you have this whole thing, now you come to the famous question that people have. That is, what does Torah say about the death penalty today? Big debate. America has it. Other countries, most of the other Western countries don't have it. Israel has it like only for Nazis, right? So the question is, what does Torah have to say? Now, we're not going to address that now, but I just want to say one point. Very often people say, oh, you can't have. You need to have Sanhedrin. You need to have Sanhedrin and you don't have Sanhedrin today, so that by definition means there should be no death penalty. Well, I think this class has shown that that's not a good argument. Maybe it's an argument. In other words, it's a machlokes. At the very least, it's a machlokes, number one. Number two, people say, oh, you can have. Why? Because you never have two witnesses that give testimony, and the hasra, and the murderer never says, I'm a kabul hasra, and so therefore all these people cannot be killed. I think we also saw that that's not an argument. It's not an argument, because we see that there's a second system. So where does that leave us? That's an open question. Where does that leave us? How does this information inform what should and shouldn't be in a system? I'm leaving that as an open question. It's for you to think. But what we need to clarify, that the idea of it's a slam dunk because of the one in 70 years or the 1 in 7 years, people are quoting that all the time. You can't quote that. I mean, it could be part of the conversation, but it's only half of the conversation. It's not the full conversation. Just want to conclude with one vart. And the vart is as follows. We saw earlier the Rambam quoting that a bezdin that killed once in 7 years is considered a murderous court. And I told you there's another sheet that says 1 in 70 years is a murderous court. Why? But Pashtus, we assume the reason it's a murderous court is because it means something's wrong with their procedures. Because how could it be that within the Torah system, obviously, how could it be within the Torah system that you're having such a number of executions? It should be so rare. That's Bapashtus. So Bapashtus it is that their procedures are flawed. The Rebbe spoke a few times of the following Nakuda. Procedures are flawed. We can't accuse a bezdin of their procedures being flawed. Procedures are perfect. And yet still, they're called a murderous court. Why? Because what's a judge? What's a judge? A judge is not someone who sits in his chambers and he waits for a case to happen, and then it comes, and then he says, oh, there was a murder, bloody murder, what are we going to do about it? That's not a judge. A true judge, I'll be told, doesn't do that. They brought from a Medrash Tana Devei Eliyahu, that speaks about how the Sanhedrin used to go to visit the cities and the villages all around Eretz Yisrael to teach, to inspire, to fabring. That's a judge. Prevention. You didn't do enough to prevent it. You didn't do enough to prevent it. So yeah, the guy was Chayav Misa and you killed him. So why you followed all your procedures that are perfect. So why you called a murderous court? You called a murderous court because it happened on your watch. A true judge, you could have done more to promote peace in society, to promote health in society, to promote the harmony in society, to promote education in society. Prevention. So that for sure is something to think about, is that if we want to live in a society where we don't have these types of issues, as much as there needs to be a proper reaction, and there definitely needs to be a proper reaction, it's to decide what that proper reaction is, but much more than that, the Yiddish approach would be, and I think much more important than that, is what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen? And if we don't do enough to make sure it doesn't happen, then the message of the Sikh is, then that's on us. The main thing is that we shouldn't hear for these types of things, we shouldn't happen. There should be Shalom al Yisrael.